welcome to Science Friday.
Here's some for E as well. The one on the top here is one of the ways that you can define E.
What makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution?
So this can be, like, in the case of this paper, gyrification or brain folds.
A neuroscientist started to look at the brain as
like the
more as an
interconnected.
I'm asking incredibly negative consequences.
Not to what
apart, and I'll start with a roadmap of my presentation. So first I'm going to go over what definition of consciousness I'm using for this presentation, then go into an example study where they're trying to measure consciousness. It's like a kind of neuroscience slash psychology kind of hybrid study. And then I'll talk about what the study means, and then the implications of that, and some problems with the science of consciousness, and specifically measuring consciousness. Okay, so first, what definitions I'm not using. So there's a lot of meanings of consciousness. These are like some of them. So wakefulness, intelligence. With like the philosophical definition of consciousness I'm using, but I just want you to know, first of all, it's not this. So what I am talking about is this notion of subjective experience. And before I define it, I want to ask you guys what you think experience is. So just take a second, talk to your neighbor or the people around you, and then I'll ask in one minute after. Okay, now that you've had some time to talk, now that everyone's had some time to talk, I want to get, so first, did any questions come up? Or second, what are your thoughts about the first question? Ryan?
Multiple definitions of experience,
Yeah,
whether
sure.
it's time spent doing it or the messy philosophical definition. Yeah.
Sure. Thomas?
We thought about the ability to make judgments based off of past experience.
Yep, for sure. Anyone else before okay, Ian?
I guess adding on to Thomas, being able to make judgments based off of past experiences means you have some form of memory, would imply some form of memory and ability to
Sure.
Yeah, we were saying it's like the perception of an event from one perspective.
Okay, so on that note, I'm going to go into my definition. So an experience is basically exactly what Riley said. It's something you think, something you feel, something you see, so anything that's going on in your head, kind of. So if I feel angry, that's some experience. If I touch this table, I'm experiencing touching this table. I'm not going to talk as much to memory or past experiences in this presentation, but those can be aspects of this as well. And then this is like maybe the philosophical definition that Ryan was alluding to, which is something it is like to be something. So this is kind of hard to understand, especially the first time you're seeing it, but I'm getting at that you have some perception that there's something it is like to be you. And we think the same thing of like other people and animals, but maybe we don't think the same thing, that there's something that it's like to be a tree. Like it's not experiencing anything, even though maybe it's reacting to the world around it in some ways. And then the second part of this definition is the subjective part, and that's two things. So first, it's not objective. So when I'm experiencing something, that experience isn't the real thing. So like when I see you guys in the crowd, my experience of seeing you isn't exactly the real you. So one way to think about this is when you're experiencing the color red, you wouldn't be able to fully describe that experience to someone who's never seen the color red. So in that way, you don't have you're seeing it through some lens of your experience that other people who don't have that same lens might not be able to understand in the same way. So that gets on to the second point, which is only you have access. So I don't know what any of you are experiencing right now. I might be able to think of where your eyes are looking or something like that, but I don't know exactly what you guys are experiencing. So these two will come up later in the presentation as well. Are there any questions just on this definition of consciousness as subjective experience?
Are you saying that consciousness is the ability to have subjective experiences, or is it the actual act of continuous subjective experience?
Being conscious means you have a subjective experience. Oh, sorry, can you repeat your question 1 second?
Yeah, so is consciousness the ability to have subjective experiences, or is it the actual act of having continual subjective experiences?
Being conscious is the ability to have them. You could say your consciousness are those subjective experiences. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So this is what I got hooked on in the philosophy of consciousness class. So if you remember from here, only you have access to it. And that way, there's no way to measure it. I can't get inside your head and look at what your experience is. And so it's really hard to measure anything quantitatively relating to consciousness because if you're a researcher trying to do it, you just don't have any access to what's inside people's heads. And that's kind of why I started down this journey looking at the neuroscience of consciousness, because neuroscience or one of the things that neuroscience is trying to do is understand what is going on inside your head. And so that kind of notion to answer this question is what got me interested in this. So now I'm going to go into one way that people have tried to study consciousness, specifically one paper which was using breaking continuous flash suppression tasks, which is a fancy name that I'll get into a lot later. But basically what they're trying to do is tell us how quickly someone becomes conscious of a stimulus that they see. And the way they do this is with both a training and a testing phase. And in both phases, there's some stimulus and some action that the participants are asked to perform. But in the testing phase, I'll talk about this later, but there's a suppressed eye, which makes it so that that eye takes a lot longer to perceive whatever stimuli is placed in front of it. Okay, so first for the training stimuli, basically they used these kind of different rotations of abstract shapes. So the one on the left is rotated downwards, the one on the right is rotated to the right. And this is what they use as stimuli for this test. So the two different squares in these boxes represent what each eye is seeing. So one eye is seeing this and the other eye is seeing this. In this case, they're the same. Okay, and then for the actions that people were asked to perform in the training, when they saw the shape pointing down, or the opening pointed down, they're supposed to press the left arrow key with their index finger, and when they saw it pointed right, they're supposed to press the right arrow key with their pinky finger. The testing actions were a little bit more difficult. So these are the 4 different types or stimuli groups they had, and I'll give an example of them later visually. But the first is novel, so a shape in a rotation they hadn't seen before. So either rotated to the left or rotated up. And then no action, there's no line. So this line, instead of pressing the button based on which shape they saw, the shapes were now in the background, and there was a horizontal or vertical line on top of them. And they're asked to press the left arrow key with their index finger again if there was a horizontal line, and the right arrow key with their pinky finger if there was a vertical line. And I'll touch back on that again later. But then these last 2 are the most important. So the incongruent case was when the line, the button they're supposed to press for the line, was different from the button they would have pressed for the shape in the background. And then the congruent is opposite. So basically the button they're supposed to press with the line matched up with the button they're supposed to press with the rotation. So for some examples, so in this novel case, the shape is rotated to the left, this opening is to the left. And since there's a horizontal line, they would have pressed the left arrow key with their index finger. And then no action, as you can see, there's no line, so they're not supposed to press any button. And then congruent, you can see the line is horizontal, which means they should press the left button, which matches the shape in the background, which is down, where they would have pressed the left button in testing, or in training phase, sorry. And then the incongruent is opposite. So you can see there's a vertical line, which means they're supposed to press the right arrow key with their pinky finger, but the orientation of the shape in the background makes it such that in the training phase, they would have pressed the left arrow key with their index finger. So this is like a lot of information at one time. Questions?
Yeah, so to clarify, were all groups given like the initial no line training?
Yes, so everyone was trained first with no lines, just orientation of the shapes.
And then they were split into 4 groups?
And then they received, or I think each person got different, I don't exactly remember. I think each person just got one of these test cases at the end.
Okay, so they were split into 3
Yeah.
groups.
So during the training phase, they were told to click left or right based on the orientation of the shape, whereas during the testing phase, they were told to press left or right or not at all based on where the line was, even though the shape was still there.
Exactly.
Go back to the next slide. Sorry, can you explain what novel is?
So novel, here this shape is rotated to the left. You can see in the testing, they're rotated to the right. So they had never seen a shape that looked like this in the background before. Kira?
So what were they supposed to do if it was novel?
They were still supposed to press in the direction of the line. So it was a horizontal line, so they would press the left arrow key.
Was there a time limit? Did they have to just do it as fast as they could?
Yeah, so I'll get into that in a second.
Is there a reason that it was alternating pinky and index?
Yes, which I'll also talk about. Okay, so I mentioned before, so here, obviously just one square. The other eye was seeing this noisy pattern. So you can imagine one eye is seeing like this pattern, and one eye is seeing whatever stimulus from the previous slide. And what that does is it makes it really hard to see the non-noisy pattern. So they say the noisy pattern suppresses the image of the other eye and makes it much harder to see, so it takes longer for them to see what the actual orientation of the line is and then press the button. So, whoops. Yeah, so the outcomes they found were people are biased towards trained outcomes. So these 4 are the different cases of stimuli, and then this is the breakthrough time. So breakthrough time means basically when the image broke through the suppression. So when the participant actually saw the image and then pushed the button. So you can see for the incongruent time, it took them like 6,750 roughly milliseconds to press the button versus significantly less for the congruent one.
How did they do, what was the time of breakthrough used in no action if they're not?
I think that was reported, like they said something. I'm not 100% sure though. But this isn't, the novel and no action aren't like addressed super thoroughly by their hypothesis, so they were mostly used as kind of controls in a sense. Not exactly controls though.
What do all the braces mean?
So these are statistical significance. Basically, like a brace from here to there.
Could you repeat the question just so we can hear what's happening?
Yes, so the question was, what do these braces over here mean? And those are statistical significance braces. Basically, it's saying that like all of these were statistically significant because there's braces between almost everything. Okay, but
Sorry, did the paper explain why novel would have a lower time of breakthrough than congruent?
It wasn't part of their initial hypothesis. They did. Oh, sorry. Oxford asked, did they explain why novel was slower? They had some hypotheses. They had some guesses for it, but it wasn't part of their like initial purpose of testing. And I'll talk about that later as well. But you might be asking now, like, what does like people pressing the buttons have to do with consciousness at all? Like, it's just people pressing buttons when they see something. That doesn't seem really related to consciousness in any sense. And what the researchers proposed is that predictive processing is a model for consciousness. So what they mean by that is when you have some trained pair between an action and a stimulus, your brain becomes, or you become conscious of those stimuli faster. So they're saying, on the next slide, they're saying you can measure consciousness. They're measuring consciousness by proxy, as in the time that people press the button is a proxy for when they become conscious of the image that they're seeing. And basically they say they're becoming conscious of that image faster when they have a trained, when the training is congruent with the new stimuli. And there's some problems with this. So the first one I'll get into is really, it doesn't seem like you need consciousness to fulfill the hypotheses in this data at all. So if you imagine you're a hunter-gatherer picking berries, it makes a lot of sense that you would want to pick if berries look similar and you're picking you're picking a bunch of berries that look similar in the same way, that you should just automatically pick those same kinds of berries faster. And then when you see a different colored berry, it would take more time to understand whether or not you should pick that. So the problem with this is they had some hypothesis that had to do with consciousness, and they found some data that kind of confirms their hypothesis, but really there's lots of other things that could also confirm their hypothesis that have nothing to do with consciousness that use the same data. And this is a big problem for reasons, but mainly that their study really only was tenuously related to consciousness and didn't show anything very concretely. And there's a couple other problems with their study that I'll get into here. So first, like, this method only works with people, or they only studied people, first of all, and only works on organisms that have eyes and fingers. Basically, you have to be able to see the stimuli and press one of the two buttons to participate in this study. So it says nothing about the consciousness of anything else which we might think to be conscious, like other types of animals. Secondly, not even all humans consciously respond to visual stimuli or take physical actions. And it's kind of difficult to say what this study says about the consciousness of like blind people or paralyzed people who we obviously think are just as conscious as everyone else. And then third, processing does not equal experience. So this is what I was getting at on the previous slide. Just because it's taking longer for their brain to process it doesn't mean there's anything different necessarily with their conscious experience of it. And then finally, they gave no attempt at a causal explanation for consciousness. So the problem with this is also related to the previous slide. If we don't know what is causing consciousness, then really any like kind of correlation we come up with between some variable and how fast people are like becoming conscious of it, or how fast people are pressing this button, any type of experiment like that isn't going to necessarily be related to consciousness because it's still a measure by proxy. We're not measuring the real thing. And some of this stuff we talked about in philosophy of consciousness. But now that I've gone into the neuroscience of it, I was kind of stuck on this question of, are we ever going to have an answer for this if we're only able to measure it by proxy? So is there ever going to be an answer to consciousness? What is it? Where does it come from? Anything like that, if all the science we're doing on it is just measuring it by proxy. And I'm not sure of that question. I'm not sure if we'll ever get past measuring by proxy. We'll come up with some direct measurement. But this is kind of scary to me because it's something that, like, I don't know, like, science hasn't answered yet. And anything that science hasn't answered yet is kind of scary and kind of unknown. And it's kind of hard to see what science is going to do to come up with a future answer for this. So I just want to leave you with this. Consciousness is kind of the frontier of science, in a sense, something we are just beginning to look at through proxy variables, which may or may not have any impact on it. But yeah, it's a confusing topic, and there's still a lot out there to research. Thank you.